reacts, any sort of expression, body movement, facial expression, gestures, they would somehow give away your lie. And why is that? Because verbal might be easy, or verbal communication might be quite easy to lie, but non-verbal are things which comes automatically or naturally. So it becomes quite difficult for us to lie in our non-verbal communication. Thus, when any sort of communication takes place, the most preference or the largest number of preference is always given to non-verbal communication or non-verbal parts. That is given the most priority in understanding or taking up any sort of fact or truth about any message. Verbal is always taken after or looked at only after non-verbal communication. Okay, so we move on to our kinesics and body language. The first is, as I stated, personal appearance. Appearances, obviously, from top to bottom, anything that we have, right from our hairstyle or the clothes we are wearing to our shoes, any form that any appearance which or our looks we are donning, as I might say, would be considered as personal appearance. So in formal areas or in formal situations, personal appearance accounts quite a lot. In most cases, job interview is one of those cases or areas where personal appearance does make quite an impact. So if we look at these two slides or these two pictures, we might see in the first case, a person just goes to any sort of interview and he is just wearing a sort of hip-hop sort of dress. So even if you have quite a large number of degrees, or if you have quite a good degree or just marks or any sort of thing, if your appearance does not make an impact, I am quite sorry to say that you yourself would not make an impact, or whatever you say would obviously go against you. In any formal interview or job interview, the first thing which any interviewer looks at is the way you are dressed and how you present yourself, not your degrees or your marks. So a good impact obviously takes into account your personal appearance, right from if you look at the picture, like right from your haircut to the beard, or your shaved or cropped up hair to clean shaved body, face, and suits or any sort of formal dressing which gives you that authentic look which makes you stand apart. That obviously gives you an edge over almost any other person who is or who are appearing for the interview. Okay, so next up is what we call as posture. Posture generally includes, or posture generally is, the way we sit, or the way we stand, or the way we walk. If you look at the photograph, you would see that 6 sort of postures are given. The first is the slumped, the second is the erect, and the third is lean forward. The fourth would be leaning backward, then crossed arms and uncrossed arms. Okay, so each way or the way you sit obviously interprets or gives a different form of idea, and these are quite important aspects in any sort of job interviews or in formal environment or formal communication. These are things which people generally look at. Okay, so why don't we just look at all these postures, and let me just explain it to you how they or what are they. Okay, the first is slumped. In most cases, when we tend to be bored, we almost just lie backwards. This is one of those cases which you would find, say for example, in schools. A student is quite bored or post lunch period, and they are somewhat sleepy enough, and they have had quite a heavy lunch, and somewhat or whatever the teacher might be saying might be quite theoretical or just going over the student's head, and this is one of those postures that the students generally engage in, or you would find the students in the slumped position. They tend to obviously lie backwards or take support of any sort of thing, either the chair or the desk, and they generally lie backwards. So slumped posture generally shows low spirits. Okay. So what might be the correct posture? Erect, sitting erect, which is obviously sitting straight, shows that you are in high spirits. Leaning forward means that you are either honest and interested. So these are two types of positive posture which we can use in our day-to-day form of communication, or even while we are attending seminars, or while we are trying to be a good sort of listener. So let us look at the fourth one, leaning backward, which is quite similar to slumped, and in most cases that is something which goes over the slumped thing. And leaning backward is almost the highest form of sleepiness, and leaning backward is something which shows that you are either defensive or quite not interested. That is what leaning backward tends to suggest, and this too is quite a negative aspect or a negative posture. Another would be crossed arms. In most cases, people whenever they sort of communicate or talk, some people have this sort of posture with them. Even while we are sitting or even while we are communicating, some people do carry this posture. So the only problem with this posture is it gives some negative vibes. Crossed arms in most normal form of communication, or just the idea that it gives is that it is a sort of defensive stance, and either you are not really ready to listen, you take your own perspective into account, and you are not willing to listen to what the other person is saying. That is what crossed arm generally tends to suggest. So this too is one of those postures which actually go against your character or against you. We come to the last one, which is uncrossed arms, which is generally, or in this case, this is what uncrossed arm would mean. What does this do? It tends to suggest that you are willing to listen. Uncrossed arm means the willingness to listen. You are always open towards ideas, you are always open to what the speaker is saying. And leaning forward and with uncrossed arms, that generally tends to give one of the most positive ways, or one of the positive communication that you can give as a listener. Okay. Moving on. Gestures or hand movements. So what are these? Gestures, if I may say, gestures are any sort of movement which are made by the hand or face or head. It would tend to take into account a simple nodding of the head when we are fine, or when we want to say yes or no, or some hand signs. Like for example, if you look at the pictures, a simple thumbs up can mean either best of luck, everything's all right, or that's awesome, why not, or sure. Someone just asks you how is this, and you give a thumbs up. Obviously that tends to suggest that it's fine, and it would obviously work. When you are just sitting at the exam hall and someone just shows you a thumbs up, that somehow tends to suggest that he is wishing you best of luck. So gestures and hand movement do play an important role in our culture, or even in our day-to-day communication. We do not necessarily have to say best of luck. A simple thumbs up does do it quite does the job quite well. Apart from that, if you look at the nodding of the head, if we are quite not sure, we tend to somehow give a vague nodding. If we are quite say we want to say yes, in most cases or in general conversation, not everyone replies with in speech. They tend to suggest, or they tend to reply by a simple nodding, a yes or a no. Or somehow people are vague and they sort of give this vague expression. How do you know that it is a sort of that vague idea, that they are not really sure? By looking at the gesture of their face or the way they nod their head. A simple yes would obviously be this way, a simple no would be this way. But somehow if What does this suggest? This suggests that the speaker is quite not sure, and even without uttering words, I obviously did convey the meaning, or did convey what I wanted to say, whether I would want to say yes, no, or I was not sure. How do you get the meaning? Obviously by looking at my gestures. Okay, so moving on to our next important topic, which is facial expression. So as psychologists say, there are just 6 basic facial expressions. What are they? So the most, or the 6 basic expression would include happiness, surprise, disgust, fear, anger, as well as sadness. So there can be various tones to all these 6 basic facial expressions, but by and large these are the 6 basic facial expressions that we generally tend to encounter or tend to give. Okay, fine. So why don't I give a small example regarding facial expressions. Say for example, you encounter, or you're just going around in a park and you encounter a person whom you do not really like, and somehow or the other, as a form of our cultural aspect, if we take it into our cultural aspect into account, we obviously have to reply by saying it's quite nice to meet you. Okay, fine. So you meet that person and you somehow say that it's quite nice to meet you. So you did lie, because you did not really like, or you do not like meeting him. You actually hate that person. So what do? You lie by looking at the person, or just telling that it was quite nice meeting you. Fine. But your facial expression would not really show that happiness or delight that you use in your word, that nice to meet you. Your face would still have that sort of what might I say, sadness or disgust mixed up in those facial expression. Why does it happen? Simply because it's quite easy to lie in your verbal communication, but non-verbal communication happens quite naturally, or something that you do not have control over this. Your brain tends to act automatically. So unless you have been lying to every person that you meet that it's quite nice to meet you, and you go around telling every person whom you really hate that it was quite nice to meet them, you would obviously have quite a huge problem in faking that huge smile or that delight, and it would not really come naturally. So non-verbal communication, or non-verbal in this case facial expression, is what I talked about. It's quite difficult to lie in non-verbal communication. Verbal is always easy. Okay. This is a small example. Every one of us has heard of Mr. Bean. Okay. So Rowan Atkinson plays the role of Mr. Bean, and this might give you a small idea of how non-verbal communication plays an important role in our day-to-day activities. And if you have some vague idea about what Mr. Bean is or what Mr. Bean does, you also know that he hardly speaks any word. He hardly speaks any word, yet he communicates with the entire world. He makes us laugh, and we do get ideas, or we do understand what situation he is at, or what he's trying to do. If you look at the first one, he has that quite sly smile, so he has done something. The next one is quite tensed, and then the third one, he has obviously, this is something, he has popped something and something is going to pop, and the fourth would be he's thinking quite hard, and the last one would be shocked. So how does he do it? He employs one of the most minimum sort of verbal communication. He does not engage in verbal communication, yet he is able to make us laugh out of our seats, and yet only employing just the non-verbal communication, using his gestures, using his posture, the way he sits, hand movements, facial expressions, each and everything is taken into account when Mr. Bean acts or communicates with us. So this might give you some fairly good idea how non-verbal communication can tend to give the some of the brightest of or some of the greatest of impacts or communication, even without the usage or without the need of using words. Moving on to the next one, eye contact. So what is eye contact? Eye contact generally tends to refer that you look someone directly in their eye. What or how would this matter, or what does looking into someone's eye be? It does make an impact, or it does have some significance. Say for example, if you look at those two pictures, I might give you a small example. We say for example you're a student in your school, and in your classroom someone has just broken the window or the window pane, and you did not break the window pane, but you have been or say for example, just take the first, that you are the person who broke the window pane, and you are called to the principal's office and you are being interrogated, and the principal asks you whether or not you broke the window pane. So if you are really guilty, you would avoid eye contact. You would not be looking right at the principal's eyes and looking at them directly. You would almost avoid eye contact. You would look down or almost any other way, but not directly in his or her eyes. Why? Because in this case, even if you do not accept whether or not you broke the window, avoiding eye contact tends to give the idea that you are guilty. You do not really have to say that you broke the window pane. You avoid the eye contact, you look down. It tends to suggest that either you are guilty, or you avoid, or you refrain from you are trying to refrain from confrontation. So eye contact does play an important part. Say for example, during various sort of arguments during between couples. So if one of the couples is quite guilty enough and the other person is charging them with any sort of accusation, if he or she is guilty, he wouldn't really accept it in most cases, but look away from the other person's eyes or look down. So that is what eye contact is. That is avoiding eye contact. You look someone in the eye when you are quite sure. Why don't we take the first example of breaking the window pane? Say for example, the window pane was broken, but it was